The stem stitch is probably the stitch I use the most in all of my embroidery. It's not terribly complicated. I don't think it's any harder than a back stitch. And it just looks great when you're working around tight curves, like in cursive font, if you're writing somebody's name or perhaps a quotation on your embroidery. So here on this, I've prepared my fabric by drawing some dots, and this is the guide I'm going to follow as I show you the stem stitch. I'm going to start along a straight line just to give you the basics of the stitch, and then I'll move around the curve to show you how that looks on a curve. Since my thread is already anchored, I will start by coming up here at point 1. And the stitch is actually, one stitch length is actually going to be the length of 2 points. So 1 point here is only half of a stitch length. Keep that in mind as I'm working here along my guide. So I'm going to go 2 points over, and then I'm going to go back down. And as I pull my thread through, I'm not going to pull the loop all the way tight. And the reason for that is now I need to backtrack. And I'm going to come up at that halfway point, that middle dot in between where the thread originally came up and where it's going back down again. And then I'm going to pull that up. And now I will pull the loop all the way snug against the fabric. To make my second stem stitch now, I'm going to go, there's a half stitch length that crosses over with my previous stitch, and then another half stitch length that covers blank space. So 2 dots over, and then I go down. Once again, I keep the loop. I don't pull it all the way tight. And then I backtrack and I come up at the halfway point between where my thread came up and where it goes back down. So 2 dots over, I go down into the fabric, keep my loop, backtrack 1 dot, just backtrack a half stitch length, and then pull it up and tighten. Do it one more time. Go 2 dots, a full stitch length, go down, keep my loop, go back a half stitch length, and then come back up again. So that is the stem stitch, and really all there is to it. And what happens is as you pull these along, especially when you start working your way around a curve, that stitch is going to hug its previous stitches and help them to make a nice tight looking curve, as opposed to something where you have pieces of stitch jutting out from the edges of your curve. Let me keep going here. So as I keep coming here along the curve, I'm actually going to switch what I'm doing. Notice up until now, I've been coming up on the outside of what is going to become my curve, the outer curve. When you're doing your stem stitch, you're actually going to get a better result if you start coming up on the inside of the curve. And this, honestly, I didn't do a great job. I should have planned ahead and been coming up on this side all along to stay consistent. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to switch. So I jump ahead, 2 dots, and I go down. And then as I pull my loop, as I keep that loop, I'm actually going to pull it over in the other direction so that when I backtrack and come up at that halfway point, I'm coming up on the inner curve side of the stitch. And what that ends up happening there is then when the stitch starts trying to come straight across this way, the point where my thread came up is going to be pulling it outward like this. And that's going to help make that nice rounded curve look. So as I move along, half stitch length, the next dot is the full stitch. I go down. There's my loop. And when I backtrack, I'm going to come up at that halfway point. And then same thing. It's going to help to make that curve nice and rounded. Now, when you're working with embroidery that has these curves, the tighter the curve, the smaller you're going to want your stitches to be, the better it's going to look. Small stitches will look better on tight curves. When you're dealing with straight lines or really just loose curves, things like that, you can make your stitches a bit longer and they'll still look good. It's a little bit of trial and error and getting used to the stitch to get a sense of how long your stitches are going to need to be for a particular project. Now as I come up along to my final stitch here I go. And so now I have finished all my stitches, but notice that my thread is in this awkward spot where it has come up at this halfway point. I could have not pulled it up at all, right? I could have just ended like that with this long stitch. But if I had done that, then notice what ends up happening over here. The stitches start to unravel a little bit. So that final stitch is still going to need that halfway backtrack where you pull the thread back up again. But obviously you don't want to then extend a full stitch length. So what I like to do, and the way I end my stitch work, is I make sure I've pulled my curve nice and snug, and then I put my needle back through only just under a half stitch length away, and I make sure I put it down on the outer edge, the opposite side of where the thread originally came up. So if it came up on this side, I'm putting it back down on this side. And what that does is it just helps to pull that final stitch and lock it down in place with that type of curve that I want it to have. And that's all there is to doing a stem stitch.